who's currently retired. She's not happy about that. It's her birthday today. She's 12, so she's a little bit too old to move around so much. I'm certified in yoga as well. I did a trauma-informed yoga. We got a grant for my previous employment, and so I trained my entire staff. So I'm also trained in internal family systems model therapy, which is kind of an evidence-based therapy model for trauma. I have been working in the field for over 20 some years now. Previous to being here, I was in an alternative school for 19 years. So I started off as a therapist with a caseload, and then I moved into a management position. I supervised an entire department of expressive therapists and a transition program. So, and then I came here, needed a change. So Jasmine Young is not here with us today. However, she helped me put this together. She was an integral part of that. So Jasmine, some of you guys might know Jasmine. She's been around for a little while. She, graduated from NIU with her master's degree. I believe she was working at one point towards a PhD. That's kind of on pause right now. But she also does a lot of work with trauma as well. So that's kind of our backgrounds. So we're going to be looking at a couple things. We had a really hard time paring things down to get everything into an hour, because all of it's so important. And I've done a lot of trainings on trauma at my previous employments and out in the community. And there's just so much information. So we figured we'd take a step back and really start at step number one, which is really looking at our perspectives. It's our perspective that impacts the classroom. And we don't often think of that, but it truly does. So that's what we're really going to be taking a look at today. And then we're going to give you a couple strategies at the really beginning phase of how to manage trauma in the classroom. Because really at this point in time, we have to look at every student might be coming in with some type of trauma. And we're going to be looking at the definition of trauma as well. It's not as simple as we have thought for many years. So we'll give you some strategies for the classroom. So first, you guys should have a handout in front of you, and there should be a handout in the chat for your most challenging students, okay? So we've all probably had that one student that you think of that you're like, oh my God, why aren't they getting it? Why aren't they listening? So if you guys could take a look at that worksheet, I want you guys to kind of put yourself in the place where you think of that most challenging student that you've had. You might have several, you might have a type of student that really gets at you, where you feel like you're in the lose, yourself a little bit because it's so frustrating to engage with them. You're not sure how to connect. So we really want to look at the characteristics of that type of student, their behaviors you see in the classroom or in your office hours, specific incidents that you might have had with that student, their reputation. Let's face it, some students get a reputation. Appearance, if you know anything about the student, we might also make sometimes assumptions about their family life, how they perform academically in the classroom, and we're also looking at the attitude that they present in the classroom, okay? So don't worry, nobody's going to see your sheet. Be completely open and honest about how you feel about your most challenging student. What are the thoughts? What are the feelings that come up when you think about all these things about that student? Okay, and just take a couple minutes to kind of jot down some information on that worksheet. Or just, you don't want to put it down on paper, feel free to process it through in your head. What is your perspective or how do you view that challenging student? I have many that I can think of. Coming from an alternative school. If you can't think of a specific student, just think of a type of student that you feel like you struggle with a little bit. If you don't struggle with any students, please let me know what your trick is. I would love to know, because you should be presenting instead of me. Sometimes it helps to think of a specific incident. I recall the one student who corrected absolutely everything I said in the classroom after every word. There's absolutely no right or wrong. This is just your thoughts. I'll give you about another minute. If you didn't finish, don't worry about it. As I continue to talk, feel free to go back to the worksheet and mark some stuff down. Like I said, there's a lot of information for a very short amount of time. You're ready. If you guys want to go ahead, we're going to try this out. My coworker Jasmine set this up, so I'm really hoping I get this right and how to work this. But go ahead and scan the QR code. We're going to do a little word cloud. It should take you to a Mentimeter page asking you to define trauma. It does. That's okay, wonderful. So whenever you're ready, you can put your challenging student paper to the side. We're going to come back to it. And then I want you to think about, how do you currently define trauma? Like, what are some words that you would use to define trauma? And toss it into that Mentimeter. I'm pretty impressed with myself that I got this to work. A win. Can't get the clicker to work, but this works.
If you had to choose one.
Yes,
probably
this is
one.
better. This is way better.
It's cool to watch them come through.
Yeah. It's really fun. I've never used it through Mentimeter, but it's real fun. I've used other word cloud activities with students before. Okay, so just looking at this, we have quite a few things. There's emotional impact, struggle, lingering effects, anxiety, fear, persistent, life-changing, resurfacing, brain change, which I love. I'm not going to talk about it much here today, but I love talking about the brain and how the brain changes with trauma and how you can change it back and reset it. Struggle, depressed. Okay. Those are all great words to use to describe trauma. So now there's a second page there that you guys have, the second worksheet. Jasmine put together for us. And it just goes through the different types of trauma. I'm not going to talk too much about it today and get too in depth with all these different categories. But there's different categories of trauma, just so you know. You have your acute, which is your single incident. You have your chronic, which are situations that happen over a long period of time. Complex, this is a lot of times comes from early life to late in life. There's just many different traumas that have happened over the course of time. And then there's also your historical, racial, or what we call cultural traumas as well. And sometimes we don't think about those ones a little bit. Trauma can include things such as a young kid moving from one community to another. It can be moving from a community of one race to a community of another race. It can be, I had a student, I would say probably in my alternative school days, every single one of my students had some kind of trauma. And I remember clearly one student who was a AP student, phenomenal student, doing so well for so many years. And then the hamster died, which triggered a psychotic break, which the student never recovered from. And we had her for probably, I think, like 3 years. And she just progressively with a psychosis continued to decline. So that the passing of a hamster, which you wouldn't think of being so traumatic that it's going to cause, I mean, she obviously had some predisposition, some other things going on as well. But that one incident really set a whole chain of events for that student. Okay, so at the end of the day, we can look at all this trauma. We can see, you know, accident, natural disaster, family violence in the community, violence within your family, a loss of a loved one, including a hamster. I'm like, I would think about my dog who's 12, who's golden, you know, this is kind of the, you know, we're already prepping and preparing ourselves, so it's not as big of a situation. But you think of those things, but it's really not everybody responds the same way to all those events. You know, I'm probably not going to have a psychotic break when my dog passes. I might feel that way, but it's not going to probably happen. So it's really not about what triggers the trauma. It's really about the impact and how you take it in. Okay. So what you think of might not be a big deal, for somebody else can be a really big deal. And so it's really important when you're talking about trauma and when you have students in the classroom, that, you know, they may bring something up and you're like, oh, it's no problem, you know, just cope and you'll be fine. Well, no, it can have a greater impact on them. So we all kind of respond to things a little bit differently. And that's like the real key takeaway that we want to have when you guys look at trauma. So it's kind of starting to shift that perspective and redefine it in your head a little bit, which can be really challenging because when you're in the moment in the classroom, you got a million tasks to get done. You got to get X, Y, and Z done. It's near the end of the term. We sometimes forget about those things. So that's part one of our perspective shift. So. Okay. So I like looking at definitions of things and the various definitions of things. So trauma is defined, I mean, it is a huge wide range of definitions on what trauma really is. APA, you know, it's specific horrible event and it lists like the ones you would typically see listed. You know, whereas the Child Trauma Network, they look at it as a stress for one or multiple tragic situations, inability to cope. My favorite, because it's super to the point, Dan Siegel, one of my favorite people to read, an experience that overwhelms the body's ability to cope. And we all have different abilities to cope. Our students have different abilities to cope. We can give people the tools, but if their brain is not in a place to take that in and to be able to use it, they're not going to be able to use it in the classroom, which you probably have kind of seen. I know the students, you're probably starting to see the younger ones because they literally came from my place and they're coming to you. Students, there's a shift generationally. There's a little bit of a shift in some of the skill sets that we're seeing, and coping is a huge skill set that we're seeing a little bit more of deficits with it. And a lot of that could be because of COVID. I think it's been kind of building over a long course of time. But I think it's really important to think about it as any incident that can be considered a trauma is overwhelming that person's ability to cope. Okay. So here's I want to list out like our limited perceptions of trauma. Obviously, these are awful traumas. Hopefully nobody has to go or experience those. And then just expanded perceptions of different traumas. Including bullying. I can't tell you how many students I used to see who were outplaced in our alternative school. Mainly their only thing was they were bullied repeatedly by their peers. So poverty is a huge one, obviously discrimination. One that I think is really fascinating to study is the intergenerational trauma, the burdens that are carried from generation to generation to generation. To me, that kind of stands out in my head because before I was at the alternative school, I worked in the inner city at a group home, trying to transition kids from group home back to parents, families, or into independence. And I remember setting these kids up, getting them enrolled in college, sending them away to college, doing all these things. And they were afraid to tell us that they didn't want to do that or that they couldn't do that. Multiple of them failed and had to come back into the group home. And a lot of that had to do with generational burden. It also had to do with their community, that they've only resided in that community and the perceptions that community had, and if you were doing something different than everybody else. So there's a whole, working in inner city, there was like a whole dynamic that we were working with. You know, I'm like, oh, you can do it. And again, I was really young and very naive at that point. And some of them did, and they were very successful, but a lot of them really struggled with, you know, they're a sellout to the rest of their group, their peer group. They were a sellout for going to college and doing some other things. So it was, like I said, it was a learning lesson for me. I was like, oh my God, like, you know, or do I really help this kid get out of the gang? Because that could kill them. Do I let them stay? What do you do? So there are those burdens that occur. And that was specific to our little community there on the west side. But just some things to kind of think about, you know, especially if you have first generation students, which I know in wellness we see a lot of. We have a lot of great supports for them, but it can be hard to change those dynamics, hence why they don't change very quickly. All right, so trauma, what does it do? How do you see it in the classroom? Normally this is a time where like I show my wonderful like hand brain model. I do this to all the kids that come into my office. I'm like, here's your brain. You got your inner brain, which is your fight or flight system. And then you have your outer brain, which is your regulation system. Well, a lot of our kids, their brain is not connected like this. They're usually sitting in a position like this, or if they've had a recent trauma, they're like this. The regulation is not connected to the inner brain. They're functioning from that fight or flight. It's really fight, flight, freeze, fawn, flop system, which I'll get to in a second. But that's really where they're functioning. And they can't, so you can give them tools, but if they're in that space, they're not going to take that information in. Okay, so there's a couple tricks and tools that I'm going to teach you guys at the end to kind of help them reset so they can get more in a regulated space. But in the classroom, what's really impacted by all this is their executive functioning, which is required for classroom work, right? We want them to organize, prioritize, initiate tasks. We want them to be able to regulate, like if they're handed a test and they're anxious, you want them to take their deep breaths. You want them to reframe their negative thoughts. Memory, to be able to take the test, then they have to be able to recall information, right? Emotional literacy and regulation, reading the cues in the room. You want them to have sustained their effort. You know, you want them to be able to shift their attention. So we're working on this. Okay, we can quickly focus back over here. All right, got your more information. You have to shift and go back over here. You want them to be able to move in and out, right? So when we're dysregulated from trauma, you need that outer brain to be able to do that, right? And they're not, they're sitting in that inner brain. And literally those connections are not happening. One of the, I told Peggy that I was probably gonna go on tangents, because I always do, because I love information. But one of the cool research studies I was looking at was language. And when you're in trauma, when you get to those points where you feel really threatened, you can't speak. You literally can't. Your brain is disconnected from that side. You're in the inner brain. So you literally can't access that language part of your brain. There is a short circuit, okay? So our kids, our students, I keep saying kids, but our students, they can feel anything as a threat. When you are when you've had trauma and you're functioning from that stress response, me handing you a sheet like I handed you guys, or a packet of 3, could be very overwhelming. Okay, they're scanning for threats. Okay, they're not just seeing it as a piece of paper being handed to me. To them, they're responding to it as if it's a threat, which is kind of hard. You're like, it's just a piece of paper. Got a couple questions on, we're just gonna work together on it. But they're not seeing it that way. They've been triggered. Any questions? So here is the nervous system. So we have our fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and flap. We used to just know of our, our fight and our flight. Then we added freeze, then we added fawn, and now we have the flap, which I've literally seen in the classroom where somebody has just plopped off of their chair onto the floor because They're so overwhelmed with what's happening. That's where you faint or you can just regress. So each one of these appears differently in the classroom. So one, it can be an actual fight, or it could just be very combative behavior. So if you have a student coming at you with some combative behavior, a lot of times it's because they're feeling threatened. They're in that stress response, okay? Flight, literally, get up and you walk out of the classroom. They're gone. You know, they're freeze, they sit there, they can't do anything, they're stuck, they can't initiate, they can't go on to the next task. Fawning is my trigger. It's the people-pleasing student that has to like ask you a million questions just to ask you questions. They offer to help out with absolutely everything, but they're kind of hindering the process because they're constantly trying to please you. So that's fawning. And again, that's also a stress response. And then flopping, like I said, it's usually it turns into fainting. Some people you might visibly see start shaking in the classroom. So those are your different stress responses that you might actually see. So I think it's helpful to know these because if you have that one student, like I know if I had a student coming up to me that was in their people-pleasing mode, I have to take a couple of deep breaths before I engage with that student to give them the right response so that I don't trigger them even more. You know, which can be very challenging because we're going to find out and we're going to work on the fact that we all have our own little activators when it comes to our students. Okay. So we want to talk a little bit about what is a crisis. Okay, so thinking about your classrooms, how would you define a crisis in your classroom? Just shout it out. What would you see as a crisis here at ACC in the classroom?
Like verbal threats,
Verbal threats.
like towards me as the instructor, or towards other students, like I'd be like, oh, we're in a bit of a crisis.
Yeah, yeah. That is definitely a crisis. Yes, when there's any kind of threat happening. What other things that you guys see as being a crisis in the classroom?
I guess student getting angry, sorry, but like, it's like student getting angry and shouting.
Angry and shouting. Mm-hmm. They're more in that fight activated mode.
I think sometimes there's crises happening in the classroom that I'm unaware of because students are so connected to their world. So they've seen something on social media or they've gotten a message from family. So they may be managing their own crises.
Mm-hmm.
And though I don't know it or other people don't know it, it changes the energy.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
I was gonna say, I had an incident where I was just reviewing homework and the student felt challenged and actually said that she felt I was comparing her with other students. I said, we're not, we're just reviewing homework.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not comparing you with other students, and if you didn't come prepared and you don't have it, that's fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anything else that you guys have seen in the classroom?
We had an incident where there was something happening in a student's private life that all the other students were gossiping about, and they all got freaked out about it, even though it really didn't impact them at all.
Yeah, that can, I mean, this is all stuff that I remember experiencing at the alternative school. There was always something on social media or some kind of text or some kind of crisis that was happening that they all knew about, that whipped everybody up. So everybody in the classroom was dysregulated. And so
Right.
I remember in our world, we'd have to scrap everything and focus however long we needed to get everybody else regulated, which is hard. As an instructor, you've got tasks that you have to do. You have things that you have to accomplish. So I think the one thing that becomes a challenge for us is like, where is that balance, right? And what are we responsible for and what are we not responsible for? That can be very, very challenging. So crisis. So I remember, and Peggy might remember when I was in, oops. Oh, whoa, sorry, we skipped way ahead. In my interview for here, I remember they kept making some comments about crises. And so, I remember asking, like, well, what do you mean by a crisis? Like, because it was sounding like there was like, it was crisis after crisis. And I was like, wait, what's, I'm like, what, define crisis in your world? Because my world might be a little bit different. And it was different. For me, crisis was, we're taking stall doors off of the bathroom, taking sharp implements away from people. We're calling 911 because somebody is holding a classroom hostage, things like that. Okay, so those were crises. Or there was somebody did, you know, we've had the many as were described that you guys all kind of talked about that just dysregulated everyone. But a crisis, we want to make sure that we're not responding to a crisis as a crisis per se, like emotionally regulatory, okay? We need to have our wits about us. We need to be brain connected when we're responding to crisis situations. Otherwise, it gets really challenging to help settle things down. So a crisis is usually when the students cannot cope. Obviously, there's also the outward aggression that you're experiencing in the classroom. That definitely is always in crisis situation because you want to protect your community, yourself and your students. But it's also like the kids who you don't know, where the energy of the room, if you're like, things are off, like maybe I need to do a little check-in here, figure out what's happening quickly so that we can regulate and move forward. And that's where like they can't cope. Also, crisis is the inability to problem solve. Again, brain's not connected. They can't problem solve unless brain is connected, inner and outer brain, right? And obviously the risk of danger, risk of harm to self, risk of harm to somebody else. Take all threats seriously. I'm sure you guys through trainings have all heard that. I'm gonna go later through some crisis prevention intervention stuff, CPI. I don't know if anybody here has been trained in that. Yeah. I love the model, like the crisis development and de-escalation model. It's really helpful in understanding what's happening and how to match that student behavior to where they're at. Because if you're trying to reason with somebody who's beyond reason, you're just gonna continue to escalate that, okay? So sometimes it's just sitting and listening and waiting for them to kind of settle down a little bit before then you can ask any questions or do any kind of intervention. While crises can be scary, and we all respond to them differently, it's really important that you know how you respond to a crisis. I go to them. I don't know why. I just do. That's what I've always done. You know, I've had coworkers who literally run the opposite direction. I have had coworkers completely freeze in the middle of a situation, despite us yelling at them, call the code, and they're frozen. So it's important that you know, even here at ECC in the classroom, like how you respond to different situations. Because then you'll know what is my plan. Like I know I'm going to freeze, so I probably have to have a couple of strategies for myself. So then I know how I can get to the phone and call somebody. Or, you know, even if you're the one that goes to a situation, you always want to try to have backup with you. So making sure you pause for a second, see if you can get somebody to assist you, and then intervene. But I also like to think of crises as opportunities, okay? These are actually opportunities for us to learn new skills. And it's also opportunity for the student and the students to learn new skills. Unfortunately, it's a high level anxiety situation, but it is an opportunity to help them learn some new skills, some new coping skills, problem solving skills, regulation skills. So it's a really good way to kind of flip the script a little bit instead of feeling panicky about a crisis. Also thinking about it like this is an opportunity that we can help our students and ourselves. Any questions so far? I know I'm going really fast. So I've had many presentations I've done on relationships with students. You're not going to be successful in the classroom unless you have a relationship with your student. Relationships are key. Even that most challenging student, the way you get that most challenging student on your side and working with you is to build that relationship with those students. It's incredibly important. I can't stress that enough. So what we also have to understand is how we're responding in those situations. So if we go to set a limit on a student because say they're getting a little snarky in class with you and it kind of has gone from like fun banter to like, oh, you're going a little too far. When you go to set a limit on them, if you have that relationship, they're gonna respond better to you. If you don't have that relationship, they're gonna probably take that and get a little bit defensive with you, and it might escalate the situation. So it's always good to build that relationship. What we need to remember too is all behavior is a form of communication. Okay, they're communicating something by their behavior. It's really tricky when they're showing discrepant behavior from what's going on behind, which can happen. Behavior impacts behavior. So how you respond is going to impact how they respond and vice versa. Because again, it's reciprocal, it's a relationship, okay? So that's why this presentation, we really wanted to focus on ourselves a little bit, what you have control over, right? We have ultimate control over what we're doing, how we're responding, what we're gonna say, what we're gonna do. So starting with us and that relationship can help make some shifts and changes in the classroom. Okay. So how to shift our perspective. How many of you guys have been working in the field for over 10 years? 15 years? 20 years? So a long time. I always think of the example of the oldest nurse on the floor who they're always won't change their behavior, that they're just gonna do what they're gonna do. The longer we get into the field, we kind of sometimes get stuck and set in our ways. You guys probably are not those people because you're here doing this today. You want new information, you want to improve upon your craft, you want to be better in the classroom, grow professionally and personally. Some people get stuck, okay? So changing perspective can be one of the hardest things because you're changing not just your thoughts, but core cognitive beliefs, those beliefs that are buried deep down inside of you, just like in the movie, which I always forget the name of it. My students, Inside Out. Thank you. I always think of the one with the house and the balloons. Yeah, yes. Love Disney. A lot of lessons there. So step one, what we're going to look at with our most challenging students is we're going to look at changing and shifting our perspective on them a little bit because it does take active work to do this. It really does. So we go from pathologizing them to putting them in context. Okay. Chances are something is going on with that student, something in the family dynamic has created this student that you're now having to deal with, right? So I think sometimes putting it in context can kind of help you be a little bit more understanding, help build that empathy. It helps you also be more present, be more curious, compassionate, and empathic, like I said, with your students. Those things are required in the classroom. Gone are the days of us just handing out a list of things and a list of tasks to do. These younger generations especially are more relationship orientated. I think, is it the millennials they say are the ones who have to have their cooler talk for 30 minutes a day. So it is a little bit different. And so we have to kind of shift our way of thinking. So here's just some examples of looking at how to go from a traditional view in the classroom to a trauma lensed view in the classroom. So we always want to say, well, they chose to do that. It's their problem. It's their consequence, that's the choice that they made, and then you move on. Well, why did they make that choice? They probably are lacking skills. They have probably used whatever unhealthy skill that they've been using, and then they've been surviving off of that one. So you have to learn how to help them replace those skills in the classroom. I can tell you with the students I used to work with, because I was actually in the classroom as well as doing therapy, doing groups and all sorts of other things. They usually were lacking skill. And so I had to sit down with them and had to literally go through different skills. Even the students I see here in wellness, a lot of them are lacking skills. And so I know I've had to team a lot with our success coaches to help these students build some skills so they can be more successful in the classroom for you guys. Again, challenging when you have certain benchmarks and objectives that you have to meet in the classroom. Characterize students' behaviors negatively. So you see what they're doing as they just want to be that way. They want to be disruptive and they're manipulative. That one's a big one that I used to hear with my former staff all the time. Well, they're just manipulating. I'm like, but they're doing it for a reason. What is that reason? Why are they using that skill versus a more productive skill? And a lot of times it's because in order to survive, they had to manipulate. So how can we turn that and flip that into being a positive in the classroom? Minimizes coping strategies, which I think is a big one. That's why that whole push in many different states was to go help, teachers in the classroom. We're also teaching social emotional learning. They're doing a lot of pushing with social workers into the classroom to teach those strategies. So here's just, I don't want to go through the whole list, but this is just really kind of a helpful way to start reframing and flipping the script, okay? We always think this, I'm gonna point one more out. Expectations, you would think they know your expectations. You could tell it to them 20 million times. You can have it in writing. Again, if they're not regulated and they're brain connected, they're not taking that information in. There's a block. I call it, they're not in learning ready mode. So they're not taking it in. So it can never hurt to repeat expectations like daily agenda and stuff like that in the classroom, just to kind of help our students remember those things, okay?
Cindy, can you explain number 6 a little bit too? The systems where students have to earn support in traditional.
Yeah, so those are the teachers and the staff that I've worked with who really struggle with, rather than just offering the support, it has to be, they have to seek you out. Or it's a transactional exchange where like the staff wants to get something out of the interaction too. As opposed to you see somebody struggling, you just go over and help them, and approaching them with kindness, compassion, and empathy. It's more of like, well, you have to do X, Y, and Z before I will give you this. So it's more of an exchange for extra support and services, which, that's many years ago, ways of looking at the classroom. And still people are kind of stuck in that frame of mind sometimes. Again, especially when you get busy, like having been in the classroom, I know what it's like. And I know the preparation it takes, so it's really a challenge sometimes to stay. So self-reflection, I think, is huge, especially after a day. If you feel off about it, sitting back and really reflecting on like, okay, what happened? Why did I react that way? How can I respond better? Okay. Here's our crisis management tools that we're gonna learn. We're gonna look at precipitating factors, rational detachment, and we're probably not gonna have time for supportive communication. That will be part 2 of this episode. So hopefully you'll come back or I'll have the opportunity to come back. So precipitating factors. So what are they? They're internal and external factors that initiate a behavior. So formally trigger, now they call them activators, which I like that word a lot better than trigger. So it's anything that can trigger a behavior. The internal ones are pretty challenging to identify sometimes, but here's just a list of what internal precipitating factors and external look like. So internal are impaired cognitive ability, impaired communication skills, anxiety, stress, feelings of failure, your internal thoughts, poor coping skills, having felt like you have unmet needs. More of the external is the attitudes and behaviors of others, kind of how we present ourselves in the classroom. Physical environment, there's studies on close quarters, high temperatures, people are crabbier. So even thinking about that, or thinking of, our kids who are on the autism spectrum disorder, who have trouble with temperature regulation, it can throw you off. You know, and then I think, I want to say probably, I would assume this kind of goes with ECC students as well, but feeling that they have loss of respect, feeling that they're not being treated in a dignified manner, perceptual
Mhm.
sometimes real. So, you know, those can be external factors. And we have little control over a lot of these things, even over the temperature of our classrooms sometimes. So the one thing that we can control and prevent ourselves from being, is preventing ourselves from being a precipitating factor ourselves. Not to say that what you do, you obviously have to set limits in the classroom, but you know, if we come in and we've had an awful morning already and we're showing that, that can set everybody else off. So it's kind of putting on that performance. So why should we know them? Well, they can help us understand the factors that lead to a crisis. It also helps us depersonalize, separate ourselves. Like, most times it has absolutely nothing to do with you. You are just the last person that they saw who it just got unloaded on, okay? You don't want to take it personally, because if you take it personally, you're gonna become part of the problem at that point, right? Because you're gonna shift how you're acting and engaging and how you're relating to your students. I always said, like, when I would go in the classroom, a lot of times I'd be late because I was dealing with some crisis from another situation, or I'm always running from classroom to classroom, program to program, building to building. And so I would always like, give Miss Carlson 5 minutes. She needs to breathe deep of the world right now and set myself together, because I just went crazy running from place to place. I'm like, you guys work on the bell ringer and then we'll get started. Or I'm like, guys, take 3 deep breaths with me. And showing them that I was doing that because I was rattled or I was kind of flustered, you know, they would practice it as well. So it's kind of like a sneaky way to get them to practice some of the skills that they didn't have. I know some of the students here are a little bit older, but having met a lot of them, I think that those things can be really helpful. Okay. You guys have another sheet there in your packet of precipitating factors. So are you guys aware of what your precipitating factors are? What gets you going? Is it when your dog is gone and you don't know where they went in the morning and you're like walking the neighborhood trying to find them because you're already running late for work? Did you spill your coffee on yourself in the morning? Did your kid have a massive meltdown? Did they forget to do their note cards and we're asking at like 6:30 in the morning for like a stack of note cards that you don't have for their project that's due in 2 hours? What are your precipitating factors? Not that I've experienced any of those. Many times.
Literally, 7:15 this morning, I was like, wow, my science.
Depending on the day, you can, I mean, if you're stressed out for some big reason, you might have more precipitating factors, like some things might just get to you a little bit more. It's important to know that. But then you know that when you get into work, you're gonna have to take a couple minutes to reset yourself. So I come in, I walk down, get my water bottle filled, come back, make a cup of coffee, get in the right frame of mind, and then move on with my day. So So just use this worksheet, kind of keep it on hand, just kind of like, again, for that self-reflection piece. Like if you're having a rough day, check out your list. Like, did some of those things happen? And do you need at that point to implement a little bit of your own personal self-care in the classroom? Or before you go into the classroom, take a 5-minute walk, go get some water, come back, or run down to the cafeteria, or see what's happening in the joke lounge and come back down. You know, movement is a really great tool for resetting yourself and regulating, which is a whole nother workshop. So the next part of it, after knowing your precipitating factors, investigating students' precipitating factors are a little bit more challenging. It requires a lot of questioning, and a lot of times they don't even know. So I think just assuming and being aware that there's more going on than the fact that they're just being defined right now, or that they're just being challenged right now. There's usually another layer to it. So just keeping that in your head can be really helpful in those interactions that you have with your students. If you had more time, you would be pulling them aside and having a little conversation. You know, maybe scheduling them to come to some office hours to have a conversation about, hey, things seem kind of off in class today. Can you tell me what's going on? I want to help you. We got some resources. So engaging the students in that way can help you learn those factors. And since you guys, I don't know if you have kids cycle through classes frequently, coming back, so I don't know if you have able to see kids from multiple classes. At that point, it's a lot easier to get to know them and understand what's happening behind the scenes. So using those office hours, if you can get them in or to show up, and they do make those office hours, is a great tool. So rational detachment. So this is, I know a lot of staff that I know have gotten really kind of stuck on this one a little bit. But it's the ability to maintain professionalism by remaining calm and in control in every moment of crisis. You can only control you, okay? So some people take this a little bit far and they kind of get really distant from the student and don't build that relationship. You know, some people, they let everything, kids swearing at them, calling them all sorts of names, and they get really offended. I can't even tell you the things that people have said to me, students. I'm like, oh, they just really say that? Like, as they're screaming down the hallway? Yes, they did. And I just laugh it off. I know it doesn't have anything to do with me, but some people take it very seriously. I had a music therapist many years ago who a student yelled at her, called her some awful names, and she would not let go. She was not able to move beyond. I'm like, you're a therapist. You have to engage with a student in group therapy and in classes. Like, you're gonna have to move beyond it, because somebody calling you names like that is not gonna get them kicked out of our school. Like, that's not, they're here because of that, actually. So let's get to the root of that. But they took it so personally, they just couldn't move beyond it. And they actually ended up leaving our program because they just couldn't handle those crisis situations. So she's probably better suited for a different type of environment. So it's just something to kind of, you know, you want to keep that in a crisis situation, that emotional distance. It has nothing to do with you even repeating that in your mind over and over again. Otherwise, I would be offended every day of my life, I think, for the last 19 years. So rational detachment, to be able to do that, knowing your precipitating factors is going to be helpful. So if you have that kid who's that challenging student who's coming up to you, of like being able to like know that, okay, I know I'm gonna get triggered here, taking some deep breaths and then engaging with them. Reflecting on your own behavior, knowing what your intention is in that moment. Is your intention, as they're like yelling in the classroom, to get them at this point to even do the worksheet? Do you even bring up that worksheet again, or that assignment, whatever they're working on? Probably not. Like, your intention in that moment is to like calm the situation. So shifting those gears a little bit. Being mindful, which I'm sure you know, that's kind of a buzzword these days. Kids hate that word. So I'm like, being present-minded, I had to shift to. So staying present, staying calm, and staying focused. So again, staying regulated yourself. Most importantly, I think, are the last two, the pausing and breathing. Those are huge. I love this quote. I have one really anxious child at home, who, I mean, he had drones or like thrown out the window before, like, who like gets really frustrated and can't manage, and like just like things go flying. So I actually printed this quote out on a canvas for him, in his bedroom. But between stimulus and response, there's a space, and that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. So pause and breathe before you react. Okay, always pause and breathe before you react. Even our students, this is what I say repeatedly in my office. Pause and breathe, pause and breathe, pause and breathe. Okay, so one trick, and this is a trick I'm gonna teach you guys really quickly. And I teach this to all the students who come in. I taught it to my own children. Engaging that diaphragm on your breath is huge. That's connected to the relaxation nervous system. So it's automatically gonna relax the body. It doesn't erase your feelings. It's not the magic pill, but it's gonna go from this to a connected brain or near connected, okay? So you wanna feel your stomach rise, then your chest, and then exhale. I call it 3 collective breaths. I try to make people do at least 3. So if you can ground your feet, sit up, try to breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth. So take a deep breath in, inhale. And exhale. If you're feeling dizzy, don't go just so deep. Again, inhale, stomach rise, then your chest, then exhale. One last one. And out. So you should feel a little bit more relaxed, maybe a little dizzy. You're not used to getting such deep air. You know, we're shallow breathers, unfortunately. So we want to open up our chest. This can actually make you more anxious. So if you see a kid escalating, hey, shoulders back and down, take a deep breath. And they should be able to regulate pretty quickly. Okay, so that's trick number 1. It's a trick that I used to use all the time before I'd go into staff meetings, before I'd go into supervision meetings, before I'd go into my one career class, and I knew it was going to be a battle and a fight with every student there. So I knew when I needed to use it, and I pulled it out for myself. Okay, so really quickly, because we only have a couple minutes here, I want you to get your challenging student sheet back out. We're going to try to reframe. So in order to reframe, look at your intention going into this. All right. You want to go at this from a calm, curious, compassionate viewpoint, looking at the student, okay? You know, if you're really being honest with yourself and you've really had some difficult kids, like I can see, you know, I'm just thinking of the 2 I had, who my anxiety went, and I'm not an anxious person, went through the roof whenever I knew I had this kid in this classroom. They were so disruptive. You know, thought I just wanted them out of the program. I had thoughts of, I don't even want to deal with you. All those kinds of things were running through my head anytime I had to engage with a student. Full disclosure, it was awful. Time they took paint with glue. I mean, it was, oh my God, this is not happening in my classroom. So every time I had to take, they would do anything opposite of I asked. And I couldn't say anything without an explosion in the classroom. We were constantly clearing the classroom with this particular student. So I had to do everything possible so I didn't start to get more aggressive in my communication with that student. So I had to kind of reframe everything I thought about this student so that I could see them in a more empathic, compassionate way, which was not easy. So unfortunately, it didn't last long in our program, but it was a long road. So you want to look at your intention, then you just want to reset before you think about it. You know, collect yourself, get those 3 collective breaths, re-engage in a nice, settled, calm place, and then try to reframe that student. I think there's on the back side, it should be double-sided. Try to reframe what you had on the front side. Like, how would you now, knowing this information, how would you look at the student? So instead of me saying they're just being difficult to be difficult, they have bipolar disorder and they're unmedicated right now. They have abusive father still living at home. There's a lot of things, and I obviously knew a lot more information about my students than you guys might know. But how would you reframe some of those statements or some of those feelings or what's happening in the classroom? And just practice like 1 or 2 of those. If it's still a struggle, reflect on it. Why is it still a struggle for me right now? Usually in education, you're still thinking about all the tasks that have to, and objectives that have to be accomplished in the classroom. I know all the teachers who I always have trained and talked with and worked with, that was always, there's pressure from, oh, you have to do X, Y, and Z, admin says so. I'm like, well, I'm also admin. We're gonna take a step back for a second and we're gonna relook at things. So if you're having a block, think about that, reflect on that. Why is it challenging to shift that perspective? And that's not abnormal by any means. Is anybody able to kind of reframe things a little bit differently with your student? Your type of student? It's kind of hard. Again, being here in a community college setting, you might be a little bit different, like I said, because you don't know the students as intimately as you might in high school or.
And that's the thing. I think the biggest problem is making the initial approach. How to make the initial approach. Once you break that ice, then you get to know the student and then it's a lot easier.
Yes, absolutely. So, starting icebreakers are always a great thing, but it's also going beyond the icebreaker after that initial class and few classes that you might have. That's why I know, like, when I first came here, I tried to go out into the hall and the community just so they can see me. They know who I am. I just talk to random people. They probably think I'm weird. I don't really care. So just getting out there sometimes and letting them see that you're a human being. You're there for support and help. And then where that line is drawn, you just send them to me and Jasmine and Coursera and Miggy down in wellness, or the success coaches, or the career coaches. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. If you have any questions, or if you have a student in particular that you're struggling with, we're more than willing to help out and reach as many kids as we possibly can.
You mentioned there was a part 2, is it right after?
Well, I'm hoping there's a part 2.
Oh, you're hoping there's a.
That's the dream of Jasmine and mine, is to continue, because this is just.
I
not
thought
even
there was a part
scratching.
2 today. Is there a sign-in sheet for today?
No.
Yeah, we've got names down from who's here, so we've got it down.
Yeah, so if you guys, like I said, if you reach, you can, feel free to email me, my email's up on the website, if you have any other questions, so.
I just want to mention that starting this semester, we also have a Spartan alert for a wellness professional, so you can submit it. I recommend you talk to the student first, because the alert is a little different than the regular Spartan alert, because the wellness person will reach out to them. So if they have no idea, but they'll say it was a follow-up from the faculty Spartan alert, but you can submit a wellness alert through Spartan alert.
Yeah, but hopefully there'll be a part 2. Like I said, this barely scratches the surface on any of the nuts and bolts of a lot of it. It's just, when we were designing it, step 1 really seemed like, I think the block I always came into with training and supervising for the last 19 years was that change in how we view things. It's so hard sometimes, because we're so used to looking at things through one particular lens, and now shifting it takes a lot of work on our part to do. So that's why a daily reflection is like, even if it's for like 5 minutes, like you're walking on your lunch break or whatever, just kind of reflecting a little bit on the day. So I used to like a long car ride. I used to live in Oak Park and I worked all the way out in North Aurora. And so that I had 45 minutes, unless there was traffic, and be 2 hours to sit and kind of process the day through, like, oh, I totally screwed up in that interaction. Oh, I was really good on that one. I'm proud of myself for that one. And just kind of playing it through, not spending too much time on it, because you don't want to perseverate it on it either. So. Well, thank you so much, guys. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.